Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we are going to be talking about Dungeons & Dragons, specifically in its 29th year of history, year 2002, and we're going to talk about that year through the filter of clear, catalyst, location, entity, artifact, and relationship. So who was the catalyst for Dungeons & Dragons in 2002? The catalyst for Dungeons & Dragons in 2002 was a gentleman by the name of Luke Crane. He is specifically a tabletop role-playing game designer. He would create Burning Wheel, and Burning Wheel would serve as a major turning point in indie tabletop role-playing games. So, independent tabletop role-playing games, games that are with smaller presses, games that are going specifically in a very different direction than Dungeons & Dragons. So Burning Wheel was a fantasy-based tabletop role-playing game. It was extensive. It was hundreds of pages, just like Dungeons & Dragons, but it really, really broke away from Dungeons & Dragons and did some very, very innovative things in rule set. So one of the things is Burning Wheel was complex, like Dungeons & Dragons, but Burning Wheel brought forward some very unusual ideas. So one of them is that your character doesn't advance by killing monsters. Your character advances by accomplishing goals. Okay. Also, it in the same way that Dungeons & Dragons had a complex system for dealing with combat, Burning Wheel would have a complex system for dealing with interaction as well. Right, interaction between different people that wasn't just combat. Right now, Luke Crane is incredibly intelligent, and his work comes forward. And what he really says is, in some ways, this is very much. This isn't. Yeah, I would say this is the beginning of this being done well. A lot of at this point, many people had thought they could do better than Dungeons & Dragons, and many people tried. So at this point, Dungeons & Dragons comes out in 1974, and it establishes the default standard, right? It establishes the standard for fantasy tabletop role-playing game. And then what happens is there are a ton of tabletop role-playing games that come out with, and many of them are also rans, right? Like, hey, I did this as well. Right? And it's just Dungeons & Dragons being run under a different banner, right? And a few things are different, but overall, many games are simply iterations of what Dungeons & Dragons has done, right? There were quite a few, not a ton, but there were a few people who were like, I'm not creating Dungeons & Dragons as well. I'm creating a fantasy tabletop role-playing game that is specifically designed to be better than Dungeons & Dragons, right? And before Burning Wheel, that is absolutely, no one really accomplishes it. Many people attempt it. Many people claim it, right? But nobody really does it, right? Now, when Burning Wheel comes along, I don't believe that Burning Wheel is a better game than Dungeons & Dragons, and the reason why I do think it has some innovations that are dramatically better than what you will find in Dungeons & Dragons. But overall, I do think Dungeons & Dragons is a better game than Burning Wheel. But if somebody comes to me and says Burning Wheel is a better game than Dungeons & Dragons, we can have that conversation. That's not a ridiculous statement. There is evidence that they can state their claim on, right? It is incredibly strong. And what it does, and it really, that game, Burning Wheel, becomes a rich soil on which independent tabletop role-playing games, independent fantasy tabletop role-playing games will grow. And what these games are doing is they are pushing off of Dungeons & Dragons, saying, we are specifically attempting to do this in a better way. We are acknowledging problems with the Dungeons & Dragons game, and we're not just also-rans, we want to do this distinctly better in every possible way. And that's a bold statement and a bold goal, right? I think Luke Crane, that was what he was doing. He also did it respectfully. That's another issue. Like, there's an issue between, if you want to surpass something, you can do that by first acknowledging its value, right? And not all indie games acknowledge the value of Dungeons & Dragons. Many of them are very, nose to the sky, hoity-toity, Luke Crane was the perfect mix, in my opinion, for independent tabletop role-playing games, and he is incredibly important to the history of Dungeons & Dragons, especially the idea of that Dungeons & Dragons, and I think this is very true today, becomes a wall, it becomes a launching pad that other games will launch off of, right? And, the flames will be licking on Dungeons & Dragons even as that happens. And it's tough. It's tough to be the king, like heavy wears the crown, that whole thing. So, and also, just to be clear, Luke Crane will come out with Burning Wheel, and I think he will really master what he's done in his game rules with Mouse Guard, with a beautiful, beautiful game that really kind of is the perfect marriage of commercial intent and independent tabletop role-playing games. Mouse Guard is absolutely worth looking at. All right, so what is our location for, what is specifically our location for Dungeons & Dragons in the year 2002? It is Tongariro National Park, and this is found in New Zealand, and this is where Lord of the Rings is being shot, right? And so New Zealand will be the location where the Lord of the Rings movies will be being shot. And so now we talk about Lord of the Rings, the movies, right? So these will be all of the Lord of the Rings movies will be incredibly important to Dungeons & Dragons, and the reason why is, in many ways, Dungeons & Dragons, this is my opinion, is systematized Tolkien, right? It's like everybody loves Tolkien. Almost no one contests that his books are classics, and objectively, there's absolutely no way that you cannot recognize that he is massively responsible for the vast majority of fantasy novels that we enjoy today in America, right? So, but basically, Peter Jackson steps forward, and in New Zealand, they are shooting the Lord of the Rings films. And these films are incredibly important, right? So, basically, you have this situation where, especially for Dungeons & Dragons, where sword and sorcery is quite literally delivered to the screen, and for the first time ever, what is promised is delivered, right? There were so many poor executions of bad fantasy movies, bad fantasy television shows, but Lord of the Rings just isn't that. It blows people away, and it really brings the fantasy world of J.R.R. Tolkien to life on the screen. And Peter Jackson is heralded as an absolute, rock star director, and it was well deserved. The movie went on, the Lord of the Rings are Oscar award-winning films, right? So they actually are recognized even by the Academy as incredibly important films, and they absolutely rise the tide. It is a rising tide. The Lord of the Rings movies become a rising tide that pushes up all the boats of Dungeons & Dragons, which is really exciting. All right. Now, who is our entity in the year 2002? Well, in the year 2002, Tom Brady, from the New England Patriots, goes into his very first Super Bowl. Tom Brady, and the reason why we're talking about Tom Brady now is he absolutely was an entity within that year. And it's important to understand that Dungeons & Dragons is its own distinct hobby. But it exists in this world where sports, and Dungeons & Dragons is an American hobby that has been embraced by international communities, right? But the reality is, in America, sports are massive. They absolutely impact almost everything in our culture. They impact what we wear. They impact how we talk. They impact how time is spent. They impact the food we eat. And sports are absolutely massive, right? Now, one of the things is, while there are some Dungeons & Dragons people who, people within the Dungeons & Dragons community who very much enjoy sports and are fans of both Dungeons & Dragons and sports, there's also a distinct part of the community that really uses Dungeons & Dragons to opt out of the whole sports gamut, right? And Dungeons & Dragons community can be a haven for people who just have absolutely no interest in that. But we have to recognize that Dungeons and Dragons exists in this world where Tom Brady is winning his first Super Bowl in the year 2000, and in the year 2019, Tom Brady will win his 6th Super Bowl ring, and this will be an achievement that will be heralded worldwide. And in 2002, Tom Brady is getting his momentum. What is our artifact for the year 2002? Okay, our artifact for the year 2002 is the Yamato capital ship, right? The Yamato was a battleship, a capital ship, that was used by the Japanese in World War II, okay? For the artifact, we were talking about the literal ship. It is actually sunk miles and miles off of Kyushu. But basically, the reason why we're talking about it today is in the 80s, the Yamato capital ship, which in 2002 was actually in the water, right, off the coast of Kyushu. But basically, this actual Yamato battleship, a real battleship that the Japanese actually used to do battle in World War II, during the 80s, it would be highlighted in a cartoon television show called Star Blazers, right? Now, this is an area where you take a very real, literal, actual object, and you're placing it directly into a fictional story, right? So in Star Blazers, the Yamato battleship is made into the space battleship Yamato, and it's actually flown. They just fly it right out of the ground and fly it off into space and have space adventures with it, right? Now, what's that got to do with Dungeons & Dragons? Well, it's got a lot to do with Dungeons & Dragons, and one of the things that it has to do with Dungeons & Dragons is that this idea that things in our real world can be modeled in our fictional world. And this becomes a major, major attraction for Dungeons & Dragons. So basically, objects that are, and also at this point, you are starting to get the rumblings of D20 Modern, right? And so one of the things that starts to happen is more and more, as Dungeons & Dragons is moving forward and telling things in these fantasy settings, more and more people are saying, let's mix them. Let's do portal stories, portal fantasy. Let's bring ourselves into the storyline. Let's bring objects that are, let's bring what happens if you bring an M16 into a Dungeons & Dragons dungeon, right? And so you see this mixture start to happen, and these very avant-garde stories about what happens if we actually mix objects from the real world in with fantasy worlds. And the Yamato capital ship, was a perfect example of this. Who is our relationship? What is our relationship for the year 2002? What is the relationship for Dungeons & Dragons in the year 2003? It has a relationship with specifically vampires. All right, so vampires, so Dungeons & Dragons has many, many monsters within it, okay? Excuse me. So it has many monsters within it, but vampires will be especially featured from it. So one, vampires appear in every single edition of the game. And also, specifically Strahd, a Ravenloft vampire, will show up in 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition. And Strahd is his own character. So not only are vampires dealt with very directly in the game, but they're really embraced. And there have even been rules for player characters playing vampiric characters, right? So vampires will definitely be in there, and that is all coming from Bram Stoker's 1897 Gothic horror novel, which just absolutely captured the world with its very distinct and specific type of horror, right? So the relationship for Dungeons & Dragons in the year 2002 would be with vampires, and also, just to be clear, so while vampires are absolutely in the Dungeons & Dragons game, Dungeons & Dragons all through the 90s would have to look sideways over at Vampire the Masquerade, which had been dealing with vampires very, in a modern setting for quite a while. Now, one thing that's interesting, though, is vampires very much fit within the fantasy setting of Dungeons & Dragons. They fit within the collection of monsters that are that are being presented within Dungeons and Dragons. That they absolutely fit with that with that milieu overall. But for World of Darkness, there will very much be this situation where vampires will start to wane, and in 2002 they will absolutely stop. So at this point, that is a clear history of Dungeons and Dragons in the year 2002, and I would very much enjoy if you would let me know what you think of what your experience was with Dungeons and Dragons in 2002. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful day.